What you're doing with a walking meeting is you are solving three things at once. You're disengaging from routine. I'll talk a bit about what that does for your brain. You're with another person, so you're connecting, and that's good for the health of your brain and your body, we now know. And you're being physically active, which is the number one, predictive factor for the health and vitality of your brain.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to NeuralCompass. I'm your host, Mark Jacobstein. I am very excited today to be speaking to Michael Platt, who is a professor at UPenn. And I'm going to take a minute here, actually, for this introduction, because it's quite a combination of jobs that Professor Platt has. So Michael Platt is the James Reep University professor at UPenn, where he has cross appointments in the School of Medicine and Neuroscience, the School of Arts and Sciences and Psychology, and also at Wharton. And I'm personally very excited for this conversation today because I am myself a committed generalist and a deeply curious person. And you may be the first academic I've ever met who really needs to have a title that is this long because it is such an interesting combination of things that you work on. So you're everything from a neuroscientist and anthropologist to economist and psychologist, pioneered a lot of work in neuroeconomics. So we're going to talk about all of that today. And maybe I'll start actually with a question about how did you get here? What was the career path to ending up with cross appointments in three different, really very disparate disciplines?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be here. And of course, I took a test when I was in seventh grade, and it said, this is what you're going to do when you're, 50 some years old. And so this is I had no intention or vision necessarily of being where I am, other than the fact that I'm, I would say, restlessly curious and tend to follow my nose. So, I was a first-gen college student, so I kind of came into college thinking, okay, I'll do something practical.
Right.
But I took an anthropology course, and it just totally grabbed me in the sense of like, wow, okay, this is giving me a framework for thinking about human nature. So, why are people the way they are, and how does that reflect our biology, our evolutionary history, our culture, our language? And so I kind of followed my nose there. Did my undergraduate in anthropology, and I liked it so much I did my PhD in anthropology as well, actually here at Penn. And by the time I was finishing it, I realized that if I wanted to understand what makes us tick, mentally, emotionally, cognitively, that I was going to have to look under the hood and understand the brain. So that led me to do a postdoc at postdoctoral fellowship, essentially a second PhD at NYU in neuroscience. I was very fortunate to have a mentor who first of all was connected to Penn. He was connected to my PhD advisors, but he was starting his lab and he needed a warm body. And, I was an eager, willing and, I guess hardworking enough, person to come in and, set up the lab, learn how to do the experiments while at the same time, taking the first year curriculum in neuroscience because I really knew nothing.
That's funny. I love the combination of micro and macro, right? I mean, anthropology is understanding human nature from a very macro perspective. And I suppose neurobiology is about as micro, a fine-grained comb as you want to take to understanding the reasons we behave the way we behave. And I guess I think of psychology as sitting somewhere in between. Yeah. And presumably that gave you a really unique perspective relative to a lot of your colleagues.
I think it's very unique. I was ignorant enough. Ignorance can sometimes be a blessing. So when I came into my postdoc, that was a time where neuroscientists were first starting to try to study decision making. And they were using perspectives that were rooted in psychology. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but not as interesting as the kinds of decisions that economists study. So, that involve preferences and utility. Why did you eat the apple instead of the donut? Or, why did you marry this person or that one or not invest in that stock? And so that provided a framework, a very different kind of framework, a mathematical framework, right? That, grounded in value, expected value and expected utility that we then, in a very simple way, took into the brain. And it was really interesting because we couldn't get funded for that work. This was the very beginnings of neuroeconomics.
This was probably before thinking fast and slow.
Well, before
change the world, at least the business world's appreciation for the importance of understanding human psychology, and that things like expected utility were not necessarily how humans behaved. And I think that there was a real sea change, I think, before and after the publication of that.
Yeah. I mean, that came out much later, although Danny Kahneman and his, collaborators were working on a lot of those issues, the so-called human irrationalities. Why do we do things that are apparently irrational from an economic perspective? And their argument was that it reflects our psychology, but where that psychology comes from was sort of left to the black box of the mind and the brain. And what we were doing and what we continue to do as a field of neuroeconomics was to say, hey, we can actually unpack that. We can, first of all, understand if and where in the brain these economic concepts and constructs actually live, and they do. And you can, you can visualize them, you can see them, you can hear them in a sense. And then what are the constraints? What are the computational limitations, if you will, that then drive us to behave in ways that aren't necessarily economically rational? And, that reflects in part, as we now know, some physiological constraints that surprisingly enough, when you got 86 billion neurons, it's a capacity limited device.
Yep.
And it's limited by energetics. And then I think the other part of that reflects, and this dials into my background in anthropology, but reflects the fact that our brain is not a computer. And it's much more like a Swiss Army knife that has specific tools, like a knife and a nail file, corkscrew,
corkscrew. Have you done a mapping of the different features of our brain to the different tools? I personally love the toothpick piece of it.
I mean, not in those words, but those tools evolved a long time ago for specific jobs. They can be sharper or duller in one individual or another. They can differ a bit between species, but they're an ancient heritage. And you can't really, override them, or at least override them very easily. And so you kind of put those two things together, and you have a brain that is not optimized for the environment that it's currently in. And that would be and I'm not the only person to have made this, drawn this conclusion that, a lot of our miseries, a lot of our quirks and so-called irrationalities reflect that mismatch between what our brain.
There's not a lot in our evolutionary history that prepared us for the dopamine machine that's in our pocket that has access to all the information in the entire history of the world. It's interesting growing up with, kids now who are not just digital natives, but are, say, AI native. And my 9-year-old daughter's expectation that she can get the answer to any question at any time by just sort of speaking out loud to a thing, Siri or Alexa or whatever, is certainly not something that we had in our evolutionary history. And I think there's sort of information overload. And you talk, we'll get into this more, talk about things like social connection and how much our life, for example, is mediated by screens as opposed to face and all the rest of it that are quite likely related to some of the challenges we have in modern living.
Absolutely. I mean, think of it this way. So our brains our ancestors' brains spent most of their evolutionary careers in an environment where, nothing changed more rapidly than the seasons or moved faster than an antelope or, and you lived in face-to-face contact with somewhere between, 20 and 100 people, no more than that. And everybody knew everybody. Everybody could see what everybody was doing. And how different is that from an environment where you have access to everything, all the information you could possibly more than you could possibly want, where you're now connected to potentially hundreds, thousands, millions of people. And we're living in a technological environment that's algorithmically optimized to, in many ways, capitalize on those tools that are in our heads that, I think what we're seeing now is that those are a feature in some environments, but they can be a bug in other environments.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, and related to this, one of the many things you're well known for is a book you wrote that came out in 2020 called The Leader's Brain. And my understanding is there's going to be an update to that coming out in October. So First of all, congratulations on that. There's an interesting intersection here. So as you start to unpack brain science, understanding of the implications for business, from marketing, leadership, et cetera, is again, it's not something every neuroscientist I know, it's not necessarily a direction they would go. Did you have friends at Wharton? How did this come about? And tell me a little bit about the book.
Yeah, well, thanks. And I am very excited about the second edition, which is updated and expanded and has a focus on living and working with AI.
I was just going to say the last 5 years have been an extraordinary period for anyone who does what you do for a living.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not without some trepidation that you put pen to paper about AI, knowing that your book's not coming out for 9 months when the pace of change is so rapid. I do have friends in Wharton, but I am in Wharton, and that's kind of the beauty of it. But if we went back to my career path, I was at Duke for 15 years, and I started the Center for Neuroeconomics there, and ultimately was director of the Institute for Brain Science. And my job as a director was not just to connect the neuroscientists to each other, but to connect neuroscience outward to other disciplines, business, law, humanities, arts, and then serve as the hub to kind of connect them with each other. Anywhere there's a human brain involved, neuroscience is relevant, right? And so that put me in a position where I got really interested in kind of going back to those anthropology questions and saying, okay, how does an understanding of human brain function help me to understand aesthetic experience, or to understand how juries make a decision, or how marketing campaigns affect individual consumers, but then that eventually translates into patterns of behavior at the market level. So I had this incredible opportunity in 2015 to come back here to Penn and to join the Wharton faculty. And to start something, that was sort of the opportunity. You have a startup, use it as you want. And, once I kind of looked at the landscape and thought about the stakeholders in the Wharton Business School, it really is every aspect of business.
Yeah. So
I started teaching a course essentially in applied neuroscience in business in 2016. And that became the sort of foundation for the leader's brain.
That's amazing. And there's so much to unpack in the book that is interesting. But one of the first ones I want to talk about, because it's germane to our conversation and then also to some of the things we do at Jiminy vis-a-vis mental health, is some of your work on the importance of face-to-face communication and the challenges of living in a world where a lot of what we do now is mediated by a screen, which, first of all, you talk about some of the energy expenditure of trying to read social cues when you're not actually in the room with someone, and how much harder that is, and sort of the energy expenditure of that, which I feel, because I live in Zoom land, right? I work in my home office here on the Stanford campus, and 90% of what I do is on Zoom. And I think I'm a high EQ person who spends a lot of time trying to unpack what's happening with the people I'm talking to, and it's harder when I'm not in the room. So there's sort of the exhaustion factor. But there was something even subtler that I thought was really interesting, and I will confess actually changed what I did for our podcast today, which is the idea that when you're on a Zoom call, or for that matter, recording a telecommunication version of a podcast, you're not looking directly at the person. Usually you're looking at the screen and hopefully looking at the image of that person, as opposed to, say, the image of yourself. That's an interesting question. But regardless, you're looking at the screen, and the camera is not right in the middle of the screen. And so it's disconcerting for the other person. You're not actually making eye contact with them. And so I will make a confession. Today for our podcast, I actually took a little tripod and my portable camera, and I stuck it. It's sort of sitting in the middle of my screen, so that as I look at you, I'm closer to looking actually at the camera. And I'm curious to see how this comes out. But I'm thinking about maybe making a modification to how I do Zooms all day long as a result. But talk to me about this, because I think it's a kind of, it literally impacts hundreds of millions of people all day long. And I haven't seen sort of widespread adoption of sort of hacks to solve for this. But Tell me about kind of the work and how you landed on this.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing that this has not been solved yet. And I think we've all come to appreciate it. One of those tools, in our Swiss Army knife, in our heads, is what we call the social brain network. So it is a system that is, you can think of it as being dedicated and specialized for managing our moment-to-moment interactions with other people. So what it does is it's constantly looking out there at the world and hoovering up information from whoever or whatever is around us. And so it starts by the back of the brain, by taking the pixelated data coming in through our senses, our eyes, our ears, whatever, reassembling that to images. And it starts to then put things together, right? And to make more and more sophisticated calculations, computations, inferences. And those inferences, a lot of those are based on nonverbal cues. So our facial expressions, our posture, our tone of voice, where our eyes are pointed, the size of our pupils. We're not even aware of that, but our brains pick up on that. It's a cue to, emotional arousal and interest. And as you mentioned, one of the most important factors in a real, in a conversation in real life, in the real world, is that we make eye contact.
Yeah.
And when we make eye contact, that is our brain telling the other person's brain that they're the most important thing right now, right? And we make and then break eye contact. When we make eye contact, our brains begin to synchronize. Our physiology begins to synchronize, which is a kind of a precondition for communication and building trust and teamwork and things like that. So it's empathy. It's critically important. And as you mentioned, when we are working through a medium like this, despite these hacks, there's an offset between where the camera is typically and where the person is, and that is maybe less obvious when there's one person taking up the whole screen, because then you're kind of staring at the center. But let's say you've got 36 or 40.
When you've got the Brady Bunch zoom happening, it's particularly acute. Yes,
exactly. That is actually a slide that I always use. And so you're looking down at the lower left at Jan Brady. Can't see what's going on with Marcia.
What's so sad, Michael, is that most of the people listening to this podcast probably never saw the Brady Bunch and don't know the reference. But Google it or ChatGPT it, and it will all make sense.
It's time for reboot, maybe, but
it could be.
But,
yes.
but the point is that your brain is kind of struggling because it wants to be able to look people in the eye. If I'm looking down at Jan Brady down at the bottom, what everybody else is seeing is the reflection off the top of my bald head, and that's not pleasant for anyone. And it's certainly not.
Well, I know in a lot of your work you talk about this concept of neurosimilarity, and I guess the basic idea is, and this is true, by the way, for an LLM as well as for a human brain, the closer something is to like the canonical version of what you expect, the less work it is for your brain. So a crystal clear A with high contrast that you see on a page is no work at all to instantly recognize, whereas a scribbled A that's hard to read in low light, et cetera, is a lot of work for your brain. And there's all sorts of analogous things. And the idea is, if I'm struggling to read your face or understand if you are paying attention to me or whatever else, I'm engaging. Literally, it's physical work. I mean, you're probably burning more calories, and it's a distraction from the work that I should be doing, which is to be paying attention to your words and your thoughts and your ideas, and being able to read your expressions effortlessly. And I think a lot about this because, of course, at Jiminy, we do a lot of work with mental and behavioral health. And I think about this specifically for people who are neurodivergent, and where perhaps reading and understanding emotion may be even more challenging for some of them. And what a challenge that is. And you're right. It's surprising we haven't solved it. Like the camera in the middle of the screen and a Zoom session that kind of automatically solves for this don't feel that difficult technically compared to, I don't know, multi-quadrillion parameter LLMs that are approaching superintelligence. So anyways, get out there for Zoom.
We actually brought this problem to engineers at Duke. This was more than 10 years ago before any of this happened. And, nobody really bid on solving that challenge. Yes, I think it is harder for people who naturally have greater challenges in reading emotions, reading facial expressions. On the other hand, one of the things that I think has surfaced since the pandemic is that other elements of being able to do teletherapy and telepresence is that it can be beneficial, right? Because sometimes that's a barrier to people. I mean, I see that with, for example, my oldest son, who has a number of mental health issues. That he's much more interested and engaged in therapy when he can do it virtually than having to schlep in, to.
Oh yeah, I mean the benefits of telehealth are mere for simply logistics. I mean, among many other things, it's always been like an incredibly privileged thing within the therapeutic community, like the idea that you can take a half hour off, travel to see your therapist, take an hour, take another half hour to get back to work. It was always sort of an affluent knowledge worker's privilege. And the people who need therapy are, of course, in many ways, like sort of everybody from every walk of life. And so this is not a critique in any way of teletherapy or telehealth, but it is something that I think is worth addressing because it feels fairly straightforward to do so.
Yeah. I mean, but look, I'm not an engineer, so I can't speak to the challenges. But it would be great. I think that my hope and my vision is that the technology will catch up, and that at some point, again, we'll maybe go beyond the temporal reference frame of your listeners and viewers and say that we'll have the holodeck someday. So
well, now I'm thinking about. I feel like there's a documentarian. Maybe it was Wim Wenders, a famous documentarian who used to do a thing where like it ended up feeling like the camera was like right on him, and it involved some mirrors and some parallax and periscopes or whatever. Anyways, this is solvable. We'll park this part of the conversation, but not this my new startup idea. Another thing I actually wanted to talk about, I thought was very interesting in your work about leadership, was sort of the importance of taking walks, but more specifically, sort of the importance of neuroplasticity and disengaging from the routine if you want to push innovation. And first of all, I love this observation because one of the things, as somebody who works from home and spends a lot of time in Zoom land, I encourage as many meetings as possible to be walking meetings in person. If somebody happens to live near where I do in Palo Alto, like, please, let's meet. We'll go for a walk on campus. It's lovely. And I don't think I realized this, but you have hard data on just how much this changes the likelihood of sort of innovative ideas to come up. And I think this is related to you being sort of out of routine, et cetera. But talk more about this and what you think this means for leadership.
Yeah, no, I think that's very powerful. And what you're doing with a walking meeting is you are solving three things at once, in a sense, or you're optimizing over three things. So you're disengaging from routine. I'll talk a bit about what that does for your brain. You're with another person, so you're connecting, and that's good for the health of your brain and your body. We now know, and you're being physically active. Which, if I had to give you any hack to
the best life hack is
hack there is to be physically active. Not only is it critical for body health, but is critical for brain health. It is the number one, predictive factor for the health and vitality of your brain.
Yeah. So speaking of our evolutionary history, most of our ancestors did not spend 9 hours a day sitting in a chair in Zoom land.
So there have been a few studies. Hilly Kaplan is one of the authors who's an anthropologist, where they've actually gone out and looked at and done brain scans, for example, on people who live a more traditional subsistence level, hunter-gatherer or horticulturalist lifestyle. So where they're physically active all day long, they eat natural foods, and they're with other people, right? And they're on the move. And what you just don't see evidence of cognitive decline, of neurodegeneration. I mean, people are in their 70s, they're incredibly fit, active, no cardio.
I'm guessing fewer challenges with anxiety and depression and mental health as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's back up to the case for disengagement, in particular to be innovative, to think outside the box. So the worst thing you could do for yourself, if your boss comes in and says, I need 20 great ideas by tomorrow, like chaining yourself to your computer is about the worst.
Sit down in a Google Doc and like start pounding away. Yeah.
I mean, maybe in the short term, a little burst of adrenaline.
The 2 or 3 you've been storing up should come down. Yeah, right.
But the reason why this is true, and this again is another insight in discoveries in neuroscience over the last couple of decades, and we worked on this my own lab quite a bit. And it's not a left brain, right brain thing, although the metaphor is apt. But there's a system that is what we call kind of the task network that is here on the outside of the brain for the most part. And that's engaged whenever you've got to do routine work that requires focus. And if you make mistakes, then that's bad. Like when you're entering numbers into a spreadsheet, maybe you're typing email, really important email or something like that. And that's engaged. When you're doing that, that is shutting off this other network that's mostly in the middle of your brain, which is not well named a long time ago, called the default mode network. But we think of it as the innovation network, the exploration network. So the task of that network appears to be one of thinking outside the box, exploring new ideas, projecting yourself into the future or into the past or even into somebody else's head. So those are all things that are not like in your immediate kind of awareness and concentration, right? And those are like a yin and yang. So when one's on, the other's off. And also they can be a little bit on or a little bit off. And so there's everybody's got them, these two networks. And as it turns out, each person, that balance is a little bit different. So people who are.
It's not surprising that the extremely creative types are often maybe not the ones you want doing the spreadsheeting.
Absolutely. Well, we've shown in our data that when that network is turned way up, it's great for thinking outside the box, for exploring, but you make more mistakes. Right. And you make more errors in remembering things and things like that. And conversely, when you're really, and this is the problem, like when you're really tied to that Excel spreadsheet, you're just shutting down that innovation network. So what you need to do is to disengage. And I try to, I make this very plain to business leaders all the time that if you want more innovative employees, the strategy should not be to force them to spend more time in front of their computer, like actually getting up and going for a walk. When you do that, people come back, they'll, on tests of ideation, they come up with more creative ideas. So,
well, it's funny you mentioned that because probably the most creative office space I've ever seen was probably with the company IDEO, right? Which did a lot of pioneering work in the notion of ideation and how this works. And not surprisingly, given the origins of the company and the people involved, it was an incredibly interesting sort of physical space with lots of fun stuff to play with. And that in the old days, like, the IBM employee with the buttoned up tie and whatever, the fedora was probably not the place in which they would have expected to land. But this makes sense. And I think it's very interesting the way this ties into sort of, especially as we think about it in terms of sort of mental health, what's happened with looking at, say, neuroplastogens and brain plasticity in general as something that is extremely important for brain health. So I had a conversation just a few weeks back with John Crystal, who's the chair of psychiatry at Yale, and most importantly, probably the pioneer in the world of developing neuroplastogens for treating serious mental illness. So these are things like esketamine, et cetera, being used for major depressive disorder. And one of the things they found is that if you tweak your glutamate receptors or your 5-HT2A receptors and enhance synaptogenesis, you can, if you do too much of that, you trip. But if you do a little bit of it, what you can do is have an immediate and very profound impact on a lot of different challenges with mental illness. And one of the things I think about all the time with behavioral mental health is how we can impact these channels on so many different levels. You can actually take a drug that will change your receptors and encourage synaptogenesis. You can also go for a walk, and that walk is going to do a little bit of the same thing. And depending on where you are in your mental health, like all of these things are useful, right? Like, get the exercise, have more friends, have great therapy. Also, depending on where you are, you may or may not need meds, and that they all sort of tie back to some very similar mechanisms, though. And I think that's one of the interesting things that's been revealed in neurobiology over the last decade.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's something that we think about a lot in the work that we do at Wharton, because, I could say to you, like, for example, in the case of social connection and trust and communication, well, I could give you oxytocin and squirt it up your nose,
right,
to elevate levels in your brain, and that will have the desired effect. But I don't think that's, the approach that we want to advocate for. But here are some other ways to stimulate the production and release of oxytocin endogenously, organically within yourself. So, that can be through eye contact, through social touch, through play, and things like that. And that's a much more sellable idea.
Well, and so speaking of oxytocin, actually, it's a perfect segue into the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which was sort of social interaction, which is you've done a lot of work on this in your career, not only vis-a-vis sort of books about leadership that you do in conjunction with Wharton, but even in your some of your primary work, which is with non-human primates and studying the ways in which my lingo monkeys are interacting with one another and what that means. And I was struck. I don't know if it was a podcast of yours I was listening to, or in your book, you're talking about how the like loneliness, so the gap between the social interactions that you have and those that you want. If you are acutely lonely, this is worse than smoking a pack a day of cigarettes or being, having type 2 diabetes. And for your overall physical health, it's also presumably very, very, very tough on your mental health and sort of sense of well-being. Have you done a lot of work with the non-human primates to sort of measure similar stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So the beauty and the rationale for studying non-human primates, and I think they're just amazing critters, in their own right, but is the fact that they are basically us.
Right.
Share
so close.
95% of our DNA, the rhesus macaques that we study, their brains are wired up in exactly the same way. They have all the same brain areas wired together in the same way, and they process information the same way we do. And monkeys, just like humans, depend on each other for success, for survival, fitness, and reproductive success. So we've shown. So one of the odd things about, unusual things about my research program is not only do we do work in the laboratory, but we have a field site that we worked at off the coast of Puerto Rico for 18 years. It's an island with thousands of rhesus monkeys running around, and they do whatever they want. And we track them, and then once a year we have a big monkey rodeo, and we round up monkeys, and we get all kinds of biological samples. So we can get blood and cerebrospinal fluid and DNA, and sometimes organs, and do various kinds of brain studies as well. And what we've shown with our colleagues, and it's a huge team at this point, is just like people, monkeys who have more friends live longer, healthier lives. And they have more babies. So that's like the equivalent of us doing better in business and making more money.
Well, you wrote a really interesting article about this recently, right? We have some of a demographic crisis in the developed world, more acute in certain places in Italy and Spain and in Japan than in others. But as best I can tell, reasonably acute anywhere where the standard of living gets high enough. But now you couple that with loneliness, which seems to be on the rise, and I'm sure that things like living through our screens isn't helping. And I think the thesis is that we're going to see even more challenges here in terms of reproduction.
I mean, that is our argument. I think that it's interesting that this was such a political hot potato for a while, but the data is extremely clear and very stark that fertility rates are plummeting throughout the world, except certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And so then you have to look for, what is common, across all those areas. And we we have linked it to rising despair. And, despair that reflects a bunch of different things that impact your mental health first, right? So that I think a big part of that is technology. The fact that we not only are we looking at each other through screens, but we're just not getting out in the world and meeting people. It's very hard to get married and have children if you don't leave your room. And more and more people are staying at home.
And the challenges seem particularly acute with young people who have grown up as digital natives. I mean, I say this as someone who still feels a fair amount of guilt. I mean, I was helping to build mobile companies at the sort of the start of the mobile revolution, even before smartphones. And at the time, I mean, I'll tell you, interestingly, in like 2002, 2003, even before the iPhone, we used to call it the one device to rule them all. And the whole idea was it was going to actually enhance all of these connections. And this was even before Facebook. I mean, Facebook came along like, oh, fantastic, more social connection. And I was with a company called Looped. And the idea was you were going to find your friends in real life using the Harry Potter Marauders map that we were going to basically build on your phone. And we used to literally talk about it as enhancing serendipity to bump into your friends in real life. And there are, of course, still technologies that can do that. But unfortunately, I think, and your colleagues like Lyle Unger, who's also at Penn, and others have studied this, it appears that probably more harm than good, that the connections that are enhanced because the phone makes it easy to find people with similar interests, et cetera. And I think it has been very, very powerful for certain people and say certain subgroups who couldn't find people who were similar to themselves in the past, is unfortunately more than offset by the challenges of like reducing face-to-face in real life interactions that are so important for mental and behavioral health, whether you're struggling with serious mental illness or you're just somebody trying to live their life. And I'm not sure what the answers are to that, but this is certainly something in the field we're spending a lot of time thinking about.
It is, yeah. I mean, you summed it up very well. People have been asking me this for a long time, and I would say, well, if you really want to know off the record, let's blow up the internet. No, that's not going to happen. I'm not
too late. Yeah,
it's too late. But
as I recall, when DARPA designed the internet, the whole point of TCP/IP was that it couldn't be blown up. Actually, it was designed to survive a nuclear attack. So
yeah, I mean, and I'm being facetious, but I think it does require a fundamental realignment. I am very supportive of the work of people like Jonathan Haidt and Gene Tongi, and there's this phone-free schools movement. Yep. That's a start, right? That's a start. I think also the movement to, for parents to essentially collude and collaborate with each other to get their kids out to be, outside, to be free range kids instead of, letting them stay inside. I think that's sort of the big problem right now. And even if you look at the data from young people, they say, I'm addicted to my phone and it's making my life awful.
Please help.
Please help. Yeah. But I can't be the only one. I can't be the only one because then I miss out.
You made a really interesting point about the collusion, and I can't be the only one so I have a 9-year-old, sort of just the right age to be like, hey, Dad, can I get a phone? Well, no, not for years, but well, can I at least get a watch? No. But, she can bike on her own now, and I kind of do want her to have a watch, et cetera. So one of the things, I love the notion of phone-free schools, and that seems like a relatively straightforward thing to do. The bigger challenge with the free range kids is you can't have the only free range kid in the neighborhood, right? If everybody else in the neighborhood is highly programmed and after school, what they're doing are 7 things that are advancing their career as a 12-year-old, and I'm doing soccer and then I'm doing piano and all the rest of it, all of which seems sort of on their face sort of good. But if it means that there's no other kids in the neighborhood for them to play with, then you don't want your kid to be the only free range. So I like this idea of sort of the colluding with the other parents in the neighborhood. Like, hey, let's just and they can be a little pack and run around the way we did as an 80s kid. This is what we did, right? We were all free range. I think there's a lot of resilience that sort of comes from that and probably healthier than staring at your phone.
Yeah. No doubt. I mean, that's if you're actually out with other kids, you get to, physically do things. You get to try things out. You get to experiment. You learn about physics in many ways. I mean, it's just like, when you're riding a bicycle. It's funny, I have 3 kids. My eldest 25, middle is 22, and my youngest just turned 16. And, he's heard me pontificate on this his whole life. So he has been the real straggler in terms of he refuses to get an iPhone, for example. And he's like, he wants to go to a flip phone. And he's like, I want to be a Luddite, but he does have this issue, which is he's the only one, and then he's left.
Right.
But he's left out of all these conversations, these get-togethers, and so he feels compelled to.
It's tough if the IRL organizing is happening on WhatsApp. if you don't have WhatsApp, then you can't even meet up in person. Because in the old days, like what you did was everybody met at a certain place or whatever else. And it is, anyways, this is one of the challenges of our time. And I just think it's very interesting how there's a thread in your work that runs from like, I study this in a group of non-human primates off of the coast of Puerto Rico. And I can pull it all the way through to behaviors that we see in leadership and in a sort of in a business function through to the behavioral mental health of adolescents. And I think, of course, what underpins all of this is like the brains are all pretty similar. Like it's a shared neurobiology, and the deeper our understanding, probably the easier it will be for us to think about what are appropriate interventions. Whether those interventions are make sure you're going for walks, or we've got neuroplastogens that we're developing that maybe don't have some of the bad side effects, but will help with neuroplasticity, et cetera. Like and everything in between, because we need to help solve for the crisis of loneliness and anxiety and all the rest of it.
I mean, I want to give another example of connecting that thread. Go back to Monkey Island, and
it's literally called Monkey Island.
Well, it's called Cayo Santiago Island.
Okay,
we refer to it as Monkey Island, and we had been studying the population for almost 10 years, and then in 2017, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, hit that island first, and completely destroyed it. The monkeys all survived, and then there was a slight uptick in mortality after that, but brief. And then we were able to pick up research within 2 weeks. Very dedicated, research staff and collaborators, and have continued to follow those monkeys ever since. So what happened to these monkeys when their environment was destroyed? Think of the worst stress you could possibly be under. Their physical environment's completely destroyed. It's 8 degrees hotter there. So it's right at the limits of thermoregulation, just like what people are facing due to climate change all over the world. So this took a huge toll on the monkeys. They essentially aged very rapidly at every level, from gene expression to acceleration of arthritis. So like where
that's interesting. So you're measuring like epigenetic stuff and like looking at methylation and all the rest, and you can see the stressors.
We see it. So we create a clock, which has been done for humans too. And so even just 1 year after the hurricane was like monkeys aging 2 years. That's like 8 years for us. And as that has gone on, that has manifested. It's just worse. So you see that at the level of the immune system. We see it in the brain. We see it in the body. Like a 4-year-old monkey who's like a 16-year-old human now starts to look like an elderly monkey.
That's fascinating. Have you been able to measure this in terms of sort of next generational passing down the epigenetic stuff? So similar to, say, the Dutch starvation studies,
exactly.
Sort of the weird Lamarckian evolution thing that seems to happen with the epigenetics that get passed down from generation to generation.
So this is what is teed up for a grant that we scored very well, and we're waiting for the notice of grant award from the NIH to continue to follow these animals. So we've gotten basically every year since the hurricane, and even during the hurricane. Some monkeys were born like a week before, some during, some right after. But, we're now into cohorts that are next generation, and so it gives us the opportunity to start to disentangle the impacts on one generation, from, the inheritance and kind of passing that down. So these monkeys age really rapidly. I want to get back to this sort of social capital part of this, which is that, but not every monkey did. Some monkeys were really vulnerable, and some monkeys were very resilient. And so,
fascinating.
What accounts for that variability? And what was really fascinating is that the monkeys' immediate response to this devastation of their environment, resources are much more scarce. And what happened was they didn't just start fighting over everything. Monkeys became systematically nicer, less aggressive, and they spent more time making friends. Okay. And now over 7 years, we've tracked them over 7 years since that insult. And the monkeys who became the friendliest are the ones who are most likely to survive. They have like a 50% higher likelihood of surviving 1 year to the next than those monkeys who became the least friendly. So then the big question is, like, where does that reservoir of, that potential to change your behavior come from? These are monkeys who are not known for being friendly. They're like the most despotic, primates.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
And yet they can change. People can change too. So that's the big question for us, is like, what is it? What's the combination of your inherited biology and, your experience, right? And what you do that enables you to be resilient versus vulnerable. And what can we learn about that for ourselves? I mean, I tell this story to business leaders all the time. And I say, look, people react the same way to these major stressors. And, we're living in an incredibly stressful, uncertain time. The best thing you could do to build resilience into your company and even yourself is to build a culture of connection, right? That values it, that provides opportunity for people to make meaningful connections with each other, because that's what is going to be the superpower.
I love that, and I love this sort of as we wind down here, sort of this optimistic note. But you think about that in terms of individual health and everything we've seen from the Harvard longitudinal study of like, one of the great predictors of how long you're going to live and how happily you're going to live is the depth and number of social connections that you have. And similarly, I think the famous sort of Google study in terms of high performing teams, right, where the essentially the trust between the teammates is the thing. And that to the extent that you can facilitate a culture of trust, you're going to, not only is it going to be more pleasant, but you're just going to get much, much, much better results. I love that as somebody who's spending time here working in mental and behavioral health. There's, I think, a lot of important lessons in there in regards to like therapy is not just sort of about a one-on-one interaction with a therapist and a patient, but is also about thinking about the structures of your life that you create that will help you to thrive. And that might be, let's make sure to get out and get more walks. Let's make sure to have more face time with actual friends. Now, these things can be challenging. If one of the things you're struggling with is, say, agoraphobia, how do I make that happen? And of course, that's why it's useful to have a great therapist, et cetera. But I think there's some really interesting lessons there for us at sort of all layers of the stack, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And the beauty of it is that it's almost cost-free.
Right.
You don't have to buy something. You don't have to. It's really cost-free. It's just making the space and valuing it.
Yeah, we all got to get out there, play more pickleball with friends. Fantastic. Well, Michael, I really appreciate the time today. This was an absolutely fascinating conversation. I'll leave us with one final question for you, and I'm going to spring this on you, but you operate at the intersection of so many interesting things, from AI and neuroscience to anthropology and psychology, and sort of everything in between. Is there something you've read or watched or listened to recently that you would recommend to people who are interested in similar subjects? This could be a podcast, it could be a book, something that you found really compelling and exciting.
That is a great question. It's a hard question.
Sorry for springing it on you.
I love reading fiction, and I'm a big fan of what's come to be known as like neurolit, and and I don't know, but the author Kazuo Ishiguro, who wrote and a number of other Never Let Me Go. That's a neurolit kind of book, but he has a book called Claire on the Sun. Maybe it came out 2 or 3 years ago.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, and it's about a near future where parents are it's such a competitive environment to get in college at that point, which determines everything, that they essentially get genetic engineering on their kids to make them smarter and higher potential. But there are these off-target effects that often happen where the child could develop all kinds of cancers and whatnot. And then to help their children to navigate these issues, they also have artificial friends, which are they're AI-powered little.
Oh, this sounds like a must read. Especially, I have a wife who does cell and gene therapy, so I'm gonna. And I did not know that neurolit was a thing. Yeah, I love that, and I'm gonna put this on my short list.
Cool. Yeah, it's a great read, and he's such a great writer. So.
Fantastic. Michael, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation, and really glad we were able to talk today.
Well, thank you too, Mark. It's been great.